Jason Morris, and I lead the environmental education program at the Pisces Foundation. I'm zooming into you today from Ohlone territory here in Berkeley, California. So I've got my coffee. It's early for me, but you guys are midway through the day already. And we're really excited today to have a conversation with you. I've got two terrific colleagues joining me, Sarah Bodor, somewhere in the top left of my screen, and Anupama Majjoshi in the top right of my screen. And we're gonna engage all of you in a conversation about policy opportunities that are happening across the country. And we wanted to just kind of level set here at the beginning and briefly get a chance to understand what your focus is and where you're coming from. So if you could drop into the chat your name, your affiliation, and what level of policy you think about. Do you think about policy from a city level, a state level, a national level, a regional level? That would be terrific. And then Sarah and Anupama and I will do some brief introductions and get rolling. While people are dropping that into the chat, Sarah, why don't you introduce yourself and then we'll turn to Anupama and we'll be all ready to roll.
Great, thanks, Jason. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Bodor. It's really awesome to see so many familiar faces, some folks that I haven't seen in a really long time. So I'm very thrilled to be here. I am the Director of Policy and Affiliate Relations for the North American Association for Environmental Education, affectionately referred to as NAAEE. Great to be here with you, and thanks for putting your intros in the chat box. It's awesome to see the different levels that folks are focused on.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Super early for the Pacific Coast folks like Jason, but it's about 10:50 or so here on the East Coast. It's great to be here. My name is Anubra Majjoshi. I'm the executive director with the Blue Sky Funders Forum, which is a collaboration of funders that are funding in the environmental literacy, outdoor experiences and learning, and connections to nature space. And my pronouns are she, her. I am calling from the ancestral lands of the Lumbee, the Skarure, and the Tuscarora in the Raleigh-Durham area of North Carolina. It's great to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Thanks, Anupama and Sarah, and thank all of you for dropping all this into the chat. There's a wide variety of policy interests here, which is pretty cool. The climate for policy has changed in a number of ways in the last, let's just say 15 months or so, starting with, the role that the outdoors plays in people's lives has dramatically changed. And maybe not for some of us, but for a much broader set of the United States population, the role that the outdoors plays in people's lives has never been more heightened, as we were asked to shelter for a while and didn't have access to that. And, increasingly, as you heard from our speakers this morning, the role that education plays in preparing our young people for the opportunity to thrive in the future has never been greater and never had as big of a spotlight on it. And we have really an unprecedented policy window here. For the first time in a long time, the wind is really at our backs, and policies are popping up all over the country at all of these levels that are really enhancing the opportunity for kids to learn, play, and grow in a way that centers the environment and centers the human connection to the environment. And one of the great opportunities that policy provides is the opportunity for all kids in whatever region or whatever policy boundary to experience these things, as opposed to just some who have the access or inclination or financial wherewithal to do it. With policy opportunities, it's often a way to engage every child in a given area. And so we wanted to begin a conversation with you and then hear your experience by hearing from Sarah and Anupama and what they're seeing across the country and how they've been able to calibrate and recalibrate as the winds have changed over the last number of years, and what policy opportunities they see. And Anupama also has worked in allied fields and has a unique perspective on what's possible, really looking at some unusual partnership suspects in order to really create a rich tapestry that supports children at all levels, whether they're in the classroom, in a canoe, or anywhere in between. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah. And Sarah, invite you to share a little bit of your experience. And also want to mention real quick before Sarah starts, we have this awesome thing called Padlet. If some of you have used it, I'm relatively new to it, but it's pretty easy to use. If there are ideas that come to you, click on this link and add them to the Padlet as we're going on. And very big thanks to Elise, who's taking notes and helping us keep all this wired well. So thank you, Elise. All right, Sarah.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the examples of some successful policy, primarily at the state level, but I'll try to touch on a couple of local examples as well that we've been seeing over the last couple of years. And as Jason said, even more so in the last sort of 12 to 18 months. And hopefully those will, some of them may be familiar to you, but hopefully there may be some new ideas in there. But I just want to say first that while I work at a national and even to some extent an international level now, my roots are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. I live in Annapolis and I worked for many, many years for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And actually my focus when I first came to the Bay Foundation was focused on Pennsylvania and some of the environmental literacy work, like an embarrassingly long time ago. But in thinking about this session, one of the things that Jason and Anupama and I talked about is, I think you all probably really know this, but the Chesapeake Bay Agreement is such a unique framework for the work that you all do, and is such an unusual provides such an unusual opportunity for some coherence and alignment, even as you're all working in such unique contexts across the watershed. And so I'll be talking about examples mostly outside of the watershed, but just really do want to acknowledge that there's just incredible leadership and incredible progress being made in the Chesapeake Bay watershed that Anupama and Jason and I get to talk about all the time in other parts of the country. And there's a lot of envy for the, the goals laid forth in the Chesapeake Bay Agreement and the way in which they sort of open the door to some innovative thinking about policy and some tremendous collaboration. So congratulations to all of you. I sort of organized my examples this morning into 4 buckets. They're probably not exactly the right buckets, but that's just the way my brain worked as I was putting these notes together. The first one is really like just an explosion in interest in policy around climate change education. And former Secretary King, I think, really laid out so nicely the opportunities and the variety of ways in which we can be thinking about engaging schools, students, educators, and others in thinking about what is the role of education in our efforts to address climate change. And we're seeing some real leadership at the state level on that front. Particularly, I think most recently, many of you are probably aware of the example in New Jersey, where there was an effort to really integrate K through 12 climate change education across all of their curricular areas. So in every subject at every grade level, finding opportunities to weave climate change education into the curriculum and into the learning that students are doing. And that's a model that I know other states are really looking at and considering. But well before New Jersey took up that effort, again, you may all know a lot about the efforts out in Washington State to really focused in on the next generation science standards. So a different approach than what New Jersey did, but focusing in deeply on the opportunities to teach about climate change through the NGSS. But very importantly, what Washington did that I think really captured the attention of so many is they put their money where their mouth was, and they allocated state funding, not just for the curriculum development around climate change in the NGSS, but really put a hefty investment in teacher professional development. And I think we're all unfortunately aware of the disconnect between teachers who would really like to be focusing more on climate change in the classroom, but really just are saying, you know, that NPR study that came out a couple of years ago, that they are maybe lacking a level of comfort and a level of confidence in teaching about climate change. And so really putting some funding behind that teacher professional development really, you know, stood out in Washington State at the time. I think when we're thinking about equity, there are a lot of questions about, you know, climate change education and what are the opportunities to really talk about climate justice and environmental justice. And we're thinking about approach to teaching climate change. And an example that stands out on that front is a local one, which is in Portland, Oregon, where there is a requirement for all students to receive climate justice education. And that is, I believe, as of 2019, and obviously it's been a rocky year plus for schools. And so there's still, you know, a lot of observation being done to see how that's playing out in the classroom and what the impact of that curriculum is for those students. But, you know, an approach to really thinking about not just sort of the science or the social studies or civics of climate change, but what does it really look like to teach climate justice? And there's some really interesting work happening that's really in some ways very heavily social studies focused in the climate justice space in Portland. The second bucket, and I'm going quickly because we want to, as Jason said, really have time for some give and take here and some conversation. But the second bucket that, again, in light of COVID has really accelerated significantly over the last 12 months or so is really thinking about outdoor access and education in outdoor spaces. And there were some good examples given in the general session, but also I know in my breakout session, we talked a little bit about some of the work focused on outdoor learning during COVID. And I know Emily's in this group and she's done some great work in New York City around making outdoor spaces available for learning during COVID shutdowns and capacity limits on school facilities. Really great work on equity across the country, thinking about how can we channel funding to groups and individuals who are not getting access to the outdoors as frequently. And so you may have heard about the Outdoor Equity Fund in New Mexico that's been in place for a number of years now. There's many states are looking at that model and trying to figure out what might it look like in our state and how can we find funding. And most recently, Colorado has passed an outdoor equity fund. It's my understanding that it is still awaiting the governor's signature, but it will be signed by Governor Polis any day or second now, really. And what Colorado did was take a look at their lottery funding. They had already been directing a certain portion of lottery funds towards outdoor recreation opportunities. And so it really made sense to say, well, now hold on, who's getting that funding and how can we set some of that funding aside specifically to underserved audiences. And so they have committed to at least $3 million annually for this outdoor equity fund, which is really tremendous, because I think if you work in policy, you know that it's one thing to get the bill passed, it's another thing altogether to fund it. And that's a little bit of sort of the dance that New Mexico found itself doing in the early months after that fund was passed. And so Colorado has set up a mechanism to really try to ensure that the funding is there and it's there on an annual basis. And then another really recent example that I think is pretty exciting is in Maine. There's been sort of a long-standing Outdoors for All initiative, an incredible focus in the state of Maine on outdoor learning as a response to COVID. And so they early on were directing some of their COVID relief funding to support outdoor learning, but very recently they have directed a couple of budgets in 2 state agencies. I believe their Fish and Wildlife Agency and their Department of Education are combining funds to bolster support for outdoor educational opportunities for students. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about their approach is that they actually passed this as an emergency bill. So and that had specific requirements for the state legislature. It had to pass with 2/3 of a vote. But they looked and said that the mental health of our young people is an emergency right now. And we are going to very quickly deploy funding to make sure that we are increasing the outdoor learning experiences that our students have as a way of really helping them to cope with the traumatic events of the last year and the impacts of that on their social and emotional health. So the policy is great, but I thought the framing was also really particularly interesting and sort of, I think, tells us a lot about that shift that Jason was talking about how much, currency we place on the value of outdoors and how that has increased over the last year. And then there's this other bucket, I think, that is really like other environmental literacy types of policies. And, a good example from here at home would be the Maryland Green Schools Act, which provided some funding for a variety of different activities related to increasing the number of green schools across the state to 50%. There are some other states with robust state level green schools programs, Missouri and Kansas, that are taking a look at that. And then other, Colorado, I mentioned before, but they have legislation that sort of mandates the development of their environmental literacy plan, and just recently had new legislation to require an update and refresh of that environmental literacy plan. And then this has come up again, our last speaker, Patty Curtis, talked about using the COVID relief funding to help states and LEAs direct funding for outdoor learning, for additional staffing, for coordination around environmental literacy. And I'll drop a fact sheet. I think there's a link to it in our session one pager, but I will drop that in to the chat box to just show you the breakdown. I know many of you are probably have it memorized in the back of your head, and the timelines for using that funding. But thinking about policy sort of with a small p, one of the things that's maybe a little bit of a lighter lift than actually getting a bill passed is just helping to channel some of the tremendous federal investments that are coming down the pipe to support your work in outdoor learning, to support the MIWIs, to support environmental literacy efforts. And then also, I was so happy that she talked about the different funding through the Every Student Succeeds Act that can be used to also help support this work. So I won't linger on that. We are watching to see what the infrastructure bill, if one comes together, will there be additional funding for school? There have been, some of the proposals have had tremendous investments in school facilities. Some of the proposals have left the schools piece out, but I am really optimistic that there will be more funding coming for the modernization and updating of schools. And there's been advocacy on the part of a number of groups, and some of you may be part of those efforts to make sure that outdoor spaces are included in the definition of school facilities, and that we're really thinking about sustainability and opportunities to mitigate climate change impacts at school facilities when and if that money is disseminated. So that was a lot of information. I'm going to start dropping a couple of resources in the chat box, but I will turn it over to Anupama to talk a little bit more about some of the key elements of effective policy, and also some examples that maybe I have left out here.
Just real quick, Sarah, just to let everybody know, we're not able to chat. We're not able to chat as a group, unfortunately, in this breakout. So we can use the Padlet. You can drop things in there, or we can use the Google Doc notes thing that Elise is taking notes on. So Sarah, if you want to drop those resources in there, that'd be great. And thanks for all those examples. It's really amazing how creative states are getting, whether they're taking one-time opportunities and trying to make it a permanent funding stream, or starting with the permanent funding stream, using whatever method they can. It's really impressive. So yeah, Anupama, love to get your voice in here.
Sure, thank you. And Sarah, that was super rapid fire, but such great examples. Thanks for sharing those. So since I'm coming from the Blue Sky Funders Forum, I'm sort of really coming at this in terms of my interest in this session is in the sense of how can you engage funders in policy work and sort of encouraging you to engage your funders in policy work as well. Many funders, especially that are engaged in the Blue Sky Funders Forum, are interested in engaging in policy work, but sometimes don't have the knowledge or the connections to figure out how to do that. And so, really encouraging you as community partners, as state agencies, as allied partners to connect with your funders because there's an interest and an understanding that there's a lot of leverage that can come with private philanthropic dollars and government funding. Just a couple of days back, earlier this month, the Blue Sky Funders Forum hosted a national convening virtually, where there was a session entirely on policy advocacy and how funders can engage. And some of the examples that Sarah mentioned, the New Mexico Equity Fund was featured. There were also some examples from Oregon and California that were mentioned. And again, just I'm starting there reiterating that there's an interest from funders and encouraging you to engage them. So for example, another example to put out there, and this is also outside of the Mid-Atlantic, but mentioning an example from Oregon where there was an outdoor school for all legislation that was passed. It was sort of shepherded by a private foundation, the Gray Family Foundation, which is a Blue Sky Funders Forum member. And what was shared at the policy panel a couple of days back at the convening was that a $1 million investment from the Gray Family Foundation led to a $72 million investment from the state and an additional $48 million that is expected that will make this year, that will make every 5th and 6th grader experience a whole week of outdoor school. So again, just sharing this example to say that there are opportunities to engage with the private foundation, private philanthropy space that shouldn't be missed because there's an opportunity, there's an interest, there's a heightened interest now to do that. In addition to the examples that Sarah mentioned, 2 others that I want to mention from the early childhood education space that are important. I know many of you are working in the K-12 space, but some of you might be connecting in the early childhood space as well, is that one is that there's additional federal support of worth of $1 billion for Head Start programs that was announced through the American Rescue Plan recently. And that specifically says that outdoor learning environments can be included or funding for outdoor learning environments can be included in that. So I encourage you to look at that. We can drop a link in the chat box with a link to the legislation or the announcement as well. The second thing I wanted to mention as it relates to early childhood, and I'm focusing on early childhood specifically, also because, as you know, the earlier you start providing the connections to nature for children, the better. There's so much more interest and learning by the time they hit K-12 that they're already primed for that. So another example from the early childhood space that I wanted to mention is something that passed in Washington State recently, where for the first time in the country, there is now licensing for outdoor nature-based childcare that has passed and can be a model for other states as well. This was also something that a private foundation supported a pilot program, which was worth about $600,000 and collected a lot of data, collected a lot of stories, and sort of tested the approach before the legislation was passed. And in some ways sort of that pilot program contributed to the passing of the legislation itself. A couple of other things I wanted to mention from my past experience working in an allied field in the food and farming field, which I've worked on for more than a decade before I came into Blue Sky Funders Forum and worked on local level, state level, and federal level policies that really, when you think about policy, there are lots of different ways of thinking about it. And you can think about the small p, really the institutional level policies. I see that many of you work at the school district level. So there's opportunities to sort of change institutional policies to support this work. Then also there's opportunities to work at the community level, at the state level, and at the federal level as well. So like really thinking about it from the broad spectrum of small p to big P is something that I think about. And one of the things that in my previous work with food and in an allied field, food and farms and agriculture specifically, that we talked about was for successful policy advocacy, really having clarity in communication or clarity in how you're describing the work that you're wanting to support through the policy is extremely important. And I remember something that a staffer in DC once mentioned to me was that, I love all your research and data, but really show me the stories and show me some media related to the work that you're wanting to do, because that is what is going to move my boss to support this policy. And so again, stating that we are always kind of leading with data, but leading with stories and then backing it up with data is something that I've found that has been successful. Two other things I want to mention before I stop, and then we can have a discussion, is really thinking about the sort of different approaches for policy. There are certain policies that can be low lift. So things like, is there a need for a database or a directory of providers in your state? And, is there a need for a task force to be set up? These are low lifts. They're moderate lift, type of policies like pilot programs that I mentioned, like in the state of Washington, to try out different strategies or try out different approaches. And then there's certainly higher lifts like staffing positions at state departments or grants or incentives to engage in this work. And so really thinking about the spectrum of policy again, and if you are in an environment that is super supportive, then yes, aim for the high level lift that can happen. And I think it seems like in the Mid-Atlantic, there's already a regional policy, so the environment is already prime. The last thing I wanted to mention was that in my experience with policy work, the three things that support policy success are, one, as I said, data and research. You certainly have to have the data to say that this work is supporting student learning, it is supporting stewardship, it is supporting health. And I think the beauty of this work really is that there are opportunities to really enter it from lots of different sectors. So there's a health angle, there's an education angle, there's a social justice angle, there's a youth development angle, and do not miss any of those angles, because you never know when something is gonna stick, and to have data to back all of those angles as well. And then having communications and having stories to back that data would be really helpful, is always really helpful as well. The second thing I would say is a diverse coalition, and kind of gets to my first point, is to really think about who else can you be engaging in this work, who else can come to this and support your work. So whether it's the Department of Agriculture, let's say, who is all about supporting school gardens, let's say, they are going through a certain set of own policies that they're supporting. Is there an opportunity to connect with them? And the third thing I would say is political will. I mean, this issue is not political. It is certainly a bipartisan issue, and so really sort of thinking about how you can leverage that, because honestly, that's not a very common thing in legislative work. And so really using that win-win approach of you can't really go wrong with this, and it's really a matter of how you convince the legislators, or how you convince the decision makers, depending on which level of policy you're working on, with what kind of things that are of interest to them. So I'll stop there and pass it back to Jason to kind of lead us through a discussion.
Thank you, Anupama and Sarah, for those examples. And one of the things that you touched on there towards the end, Anupama, I think is really important, which is the multiple angles that you can come at this. And what we know about environmental literacy, it's very clear in the research, is that it's not a one-time thing. You don't go on one field trip or have one learning experience and all of a sudden become environmentally literate. What we know is that we need repeated, meaningful, high quality experiences over time, over a child's formative years. And so how important it is to start somewhere and have some policy injected into the daily life of kids from some angle is really important. And it helps then the nonprofit sector, which are tremendous partners to agencies and school systems, organize themselves into more of a continuum so kids can have those experiences. And we've seen that with policies across the country. And, specifically the one in Oregon, which the state of Oregon put its thumb on the 5th and 6th grade rung of the ladder. And slowly but surely, most of the nonprofits started to organize themselves in different grades that were not 5th and 6th grade, because the state was covering that one. And so that was really helpful to start promoting the continuum. So let's hear from you. You all have a tremendous opportunity for policy in your area, and a lot of you have some great examples that you've been dropping in here. And we'd really love to learn from you and learn from each other about what's working, what are some of the barriers, and maybe most importantly, with the wind at our back, what opportunities are you seeing in the work that you do right now for policy? I don't think we have a hand raising feature, so if the spirit moves you, unmute and give it a go.
So this is Bruce Lesh for the Maryland State Department of Education. I want to thank
Hi,
Sarah
Bruce.
for sharing that one pager on the use of COVID funds for outdoor education and environmental literacy. It's a really helpful tool. That's such a giant pot of money that I think it's a great opportunity to look for places to allow it to support outdoor education, and particularly as it cuts across social emotional learning for students as we're dealing with coming back to school and any issues that kids have. So I just wanted to thank her for sharing that.
Thanks, Bruce. Also for mentioning social and emotional learning, another angle into this work. As you all know very well, the waves of reform or the waves of change wash through every couple of years. SEL seems to be the hot ticket this year and last year for very good reason. But whatever angle works is a way to get it started. What other examples or ahas are out there in this group?
This is Candace from Virginia. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Candace.
As many of you know, Virginia is a fairly conservative state, and I really appreciated Sarah's pointing out the value of the Chesapeake Bay Agreement to advance environmental education initiatives. It has been a powerful force in our state to weave environmental literacy into our standards. We're just beginning the conversation to weave in climate science standards into our next iteration of our science standards. We do have it in there somewhat, but it's not really clearly stated and woven throughout the education experience. And I have to say that the Chesapeake Bay program and this education work group has had a huge influence in our state to help us advance environmental literacy principles. And because we are a conservative state, it really does help to have this network, to have these ideas, to have some of the funding opportunities that are presented to all of us in the Chesapeake Bay jurisdiction. So these kinds of huge regional networks for the environmental education community are extremely valuable. And they really are helping us in Virginia to move forward with environmental education and really do dive into those deep issues that are impacting our students now and will continue to impact them in the future.
Candace, I thank you for that. And I just want to mention, because I didn't earlier, that one thing that we're seeing a fair amount of success when it comes to some of this COVID relief funding, and this isn't necessarily isolated to the education specific funding, is sort of just channeling extra money into existing grant programs. So if there are like existing state state administered funding programs that could just house some additional relief funding to support environmental and outdoor education, that might be an opportunity. And the example I'll give is North Carolina. I think it was in one of the first CARES 1 or CARES 2 Act funding, took an existing outdoor heritage grant program, so a grant program that supported some field trips for students and some outdoor learning experiences throughout the state, and normally is a $200,000 program. And they just went ahead and made it a $2 million program for as long as the funding holds out. And so there are some ways that, again, to that point that Anupama made on a light lift, to just really dramatically increase the amount of funding that might sit in a particular program.
There are some great examples on the Padlet. I encourage you to look through those, and want to lift up this third column here about equity and how to ensure that the policy actually has equity components and maybe most importantly, equity outcomes. You know, there has long been a challenge for policy pushes where legislators say, okay, we're ready for a policy, and then really quickly it's got to be crafted and thrown into the grist. But the challenge there is often it's not crafted with and by those who are most impacted by either the injustice that's going on or positively by a policy that could be taking shape. So I really appreciate that comment there. And it underscores the need to do the organizing way on the front end and the stakeholder building work, which is something, as Anupama was describing, the organizing and the educating is something that private philanthropy can engage in directly. Because it's not lobbying and it's not with a specific bill, but there is totally a need to get the siloed kind of infrastructure of organizations and stakeholder groups on a consistent page, and really have those policy ideas generated from the front lines. And typically, when that happens, you get broad public support. When that doesn't happen, you end up with just a slice of a given community receiving the benefits from a given policy. So thank you for writing that. And again, would love to hear some of you maybe illustrate these examples. We've got some from New York City, where the students took the lead and started the petition, and that generated a policy. We got, we just heard Candace talk about how different states, even bound by a common stunning natural resource such as the Bay, take different political stances on it. Some are more conservative, some are not. And how does a regional policy enhance all of that? So those are really great examples and helpful for us to hear. Anyone else want to illustrate one of the things that they wrote down or share an example?
Sure, I wrote a couple things on the Padlet. So
Thanks,
one
Steve.
under the third column was about meeting learners where they are to ensure equity, and that there's a lot of things to unpack that with. But in brief, we've definitely learned through COVID that that not only we've learned of new, I guess, or raise the awareness of the different issues that we have in equity, providing environmental education, learning for all. Yeah, before COVID, it was like we'd have school districts or groups of school come to us, and we'd only once in a while go out to different different places. But we during COVID, a lot of things switched to virtual learning. And we thought, okay, that'll be fine. We'll get to everybody now, and we'll have a larger reach, which we did have a larger reach, but we can't get to everybody because those same communities that are underrepresented, that can't afford afford the buses to go somewhere, are the same ones that have problems with Wi-Fi and internet access. So they also couldn't access the virtual learning resources. So it's important to remember, we need to go to those communities. And then part of that also is there's a lot of research on place-based learning and then it's community, then you're working with the local communities in a place relevant, so that if policies and funding can support that, that is supported by research literature also. And just to see that carry through would be good. And then I guess I'll mention, because there's new people on this group and the last group I was in, and Adam mentioned it too. The last group I also wrote under there, under the policy one, Pennsylvania we're going through right now, and I can mention this because I'm representing a nonprofit, so I'm allowed to say these kind of things. Pennsylvania's going through an update of their science, environment, ecology, and technology standards, and we're right in the middle of a 30-day public comment period, and we want to be able to move forward and wholly include environmental education, agricultural education, some things that, other things, integrated pest management and investigation of environmental issues, and creating some action plans to do something about them on a local basis. Those things are missing in the proposed updates to Pennsylvania standards for K through 12. So I put the link in there too. You don't have to be from Pennsylvania to submit a public comment. So anybody can submit a public comment. Check out that link, please. We want to go back forward, not backwards, in policy related to standards in Pennsylvania. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Jason,
Anupama.
can I pick out one more thing from the third
Please.
column related to equity? There's a comment in there about, you mentioned the language, kind of really having the language clear that it is prioritizing underserved communities, or getting to what you're wanting to get to with your equity lens, and really assessing whether those outcomes that or the intended outcomes of the policy are met or not is important. And you can do that, again, making a case that private foundations and private money might be available to do that kind of a study for a particular grant program or a particular piece of legislation. There's also a comment in there to say that assess whether communities that we're trying to reach through this equity lens have the capacity to apply for those grants or not. And so adding language to say, or adding funding specifically to, let's say, an existing program to provide technical assistance to underserved communities to be able to apply for those grant dollars is something to think about. And then support and training as well for grant writing, because often the underserved communities do not have the capacity, don't have the knowledge to apply for those large government grants.
Thanks for lifting that up, Anupama. We've seen that the unintentional negative consequences happen in some of the access and equity related policies as it just relates to access to the outdoors, where access to the outdoors, if you don't feel welcome or you don't have a sense of belonging when you get there, doesn't mean much. And so needing to work on all areas of the issue in order to make the equity piece actually center for all people is really an important step. Got a couple, I think we were extended generous 5 extra minutes, so we've got about 5 more minutes. Certainly would love to hear any other examples or questions for Sarah and or Anupama.
Hi, Frank Rogers here. I just want to shout out to Blue Sky on your website for highlighting American Forest's urban forestry program. And just as a policy issue, just so everyone knows, there are several pieces of national legislation moving to plant trees. One of them is the Trees Act, which very interestingly is not in the U.S. Forest Service, but Department of Energy. If this passes, Department of Energy will be supporting planting trees in urban and residential areas. So as a school system, keep your eye out for that and make sure you get those trees first. because studies have shown that students on Sylvan campuses that have healthy trees and tree canopy, they have less days of absenteeism from asthma. And studies are showing the causal relationship between a green environment and a student's ability to recover quicker from stress and stay more focused. So when as you hear about these tree planting programs, make sure you get your foot in the door and get those trees for your campus and get the students engaged in making the planting plan and choosing what species they want to. And if you can imagine, on some campuses, we talked about this with Stroud, when some campuses, the students are actually there from K all the way through graduation, right? It's one big school campus with elementary, middle, and high school. And you can imagine a first grader planting a tree and seeing that tree grow all the way through to their high school graduation. It's a very powerful, trees are just very powerful, tactile, living beings that students learn from and live with.
Thank you, Frank. Random side note related to that. I'm enjoying reading the Lord of the Rings with my 8-year-old daughter right now, and we just got to the part about the Ents and the the great trees and the speed at which they move or don't move over time and communicate with us. All right, anybody else? We got 3 or 4. Go ahead, Sarah.
Jason,
Yeah.
Carrie.
Hi, Sarah, Jason, and Anupama. A great session. I want to raise something that is we're becoming more aware of in the federal environment, and that is restrictions that exist due to Supreme Court cases in terms of how specific we can be in the federal grant world in calling out applications from BIPOC-led organizations or any groups, any projects that specifically target racial groups. We cannot do it legally. This is a significant barrier and really needs to be addressed at a very high policy level. And it has implications that filter down. We're hearing from our grantees increasingly that due to privacy issues and other concerns, they are also unable to collect demographic information from their participants. And so this is really hindering our ability to both target particular groups from the federal grant making world, but also to know if our grantees are reaching those groups because they are unable to collect that information. So there are multiple policies that are getting in the way here, but they're really serving as impediments to moving forward. And I'm hopeful the Biden administration at the Department of Justice level will recognize this and begin to tackle it. But there are some huge barriers that prevent feds from being more progressive in this space.
Oh.
That's really interesting, Carrie, and thanks for bringing that forward. I'm wondering, I'm assuming the answer would be yes, but is this kind of in conflict with the Justice 40 initiative and creating probably some real challenges for NOAA and other agencies in meeting that goal?
Definitely. That's why I'm hoping the DOJ will recognize that they have a conflict here. And we had a grants workshop recently where we sat with our lawyers and they said, can't do this, can't do that, can't do this. Yes, we recognize that it's being called for in the executive orders and we want to do it, but legally we cannot do it. And so when you see in, wording, especially in NOAA grants that talk about underserved or highly vulnerable populations, those are all being used as surrogates for words we might use otherwise, like particular racial groups or something like that. So we are not able to do that. And that's across the federal government.
Oh, geez. Barriers. All right, well, we have 1 minute, just got the, just got the warning here, but please join me in thanking Anupama and Sarah for sharing their wisdom with us. They're really terrific leaders in this space, and it's been an honor to hang out with the two of you. And thank all of you for your interest in this work and how it can really lead to all and every child having the opportunity to have these learning experiences in school and out of school, day-to-day life, wherever they occur. Environmental learning is quite possibly should be required, obviously, and is a human right. And we got to have more of it in order to have the world that we want moving forward. So thank all of you